Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, everyone. We've been in conversation with Muhammad Jalal about some of the issues that impact younger Muslims living in the West, and he suggested we turn some of our conversations into a broadcast. At the moment, there is intense discussion about the rise of the right across the Western world and what that means for young Muslims who are battling their own identities. Today, we have Lila and Asiya from the UK and myself, Mosaab, from the States, to discuss our response to this phenomenon. I'm very interested personally in what's happening in the UK. In effect, Layla, you guys have had around 2 weeks of intense protests or maybe even rioting and probably very little sleep. And I know you have been at the forefront in Liverpool, which is in the north of England. Can you get us up to speed on what's been happening in the UK and specifically what's been happening in Liverpool?
Yeah, absolutely. So, around 2 weeks ago, there was a tragic stabbing in Southport, which is about 20 or 30 minutes from the Liverpool city centre. It's situated within Liverpool, within the north of England. And the stabbing took place in a dance studio where three little girls were killed and many others were injured. And very quickly, that spread through social media. A lot of people jumped on to the accusation. A lot of far right leaders and activists started making up this conspiracy that this person was a immigrant and was Muslim. Um, they believed that the media and the government were lying to them about the identity of the person who, the perpetrator of this horrible stabbing, who later was revealed not to be Muslim nor to be an immigrant. He was born, in fact, in Wales. Now his parents were from Rwanda, but he was born and bred in Britain, and so despite that, they, proceeded to maintain that notion, that anti-migrant, anti-Muslim kind of notion, and leaders such as Tommy Robinson, formerly of the EDL, and a lot of far right politicians, Nigel Farage, began to almost stoke up that anti-Muslim and anti-migrant hatred and influence young people and people generally to take the streets. There was one lord who said, he made a video or he said something on Twitter that went on was on the lines of, "We have to hit the streets. We have to make a huge impact all over the country. Every city needs to go up everywhere." And there was this whole kind of save our children, enough is enough. It became a catalyst for a lot of the kind of the people in Britain who were sick of this supposed threat of.
So, sorry to interrupt, but for the Americans in the room, what is a lord? This is
Oh, a
important.
lord is, how do I say?
I think it's basically a senator, right? It's the upper house of parliament, if I'm not
Yeah, so
wrong.
they're not elected,
Yeah,
from what I believe, but they have a seat in the House of Lords,
correct.
effectively.
Okay, okay.
Um,
So essentially a legislator in the UK.
yes,
Yes.
and so these were people who almost played into this role of this conspiracy theory that a lot of people, impressionable people, jumped on. And what we saw following that was the next day in Southport, huge riots around that area. There was another so-called person with a knife who was around there to kill and hurt more children, supposedly, who actually was later revealed to be one of the rioters who was there at that protest. And so they kept on jumping onto this kind of, Muslims are taking over. We need to deport all migrants. We need to stop the boats. There was a protest in Southport. That protest where they were chanting, who the f is Allah, and so it wasn't important to them whether the stabber, the 17-year-old stabber, was Muslim or not. They still continued. And so that week, we saw a wave of protests within Liverpool and within the north. But there was a huge focus in Liverpool. And one of the first mosques to be targeted following that Tuesday riot was Abdul Quilliam Mosque, which is based, about 10 minutes from the city centre in Liverpool. And they put a target on that mosque.
Is
And
there
so
a is there significance to that masjid in particular?
So they targeted a number of mosques. There was two mosques in particular. There was one on County Road, which I didn't know existed in Liverpool, and then another one, which was actually Britain's first mosque. It was opened by a gentleman who went by the name of William Quilliam, later Abdullah William Quilliam, and he had a huge role in kind of the rise of the British converts and the conversions that took place in Liverpool and thereafter. But so I was present on that day, and Imam Adam Kelwick, who's one of the imams at the masjid, put out a video where he said, he was there was also almost a counter demonstration, a post that went out that said "Defend our mosque," which was put together by anti-racist groups in Liverpool who went out to defend our masjid. And Imam Adam Kelwick came out and said, "We're not." When he thought it was going to be quite confrontational, he said, "No, we're not going to do that. We're going to go by our tradition, and we're going to be welcoming these protesters, and we're going to be offering them food, and we're going to invite them to the mosque." And at that time, I also thought, that was quite naive. I thought it was quite, you know, uh, he didn't really know what was going on because of
Hmm.
what we'd seen was on Tuesday, people were throwing rocks at the mosque. They were locked in. The worshippers were locked in at Southport Mosque. They kicked down a wall. There was people that I've seen the CCTV footage where a number of protesters, rioters, stood behind a wall and they all kicked that wall in and they used that as missile. They used them bricks as missiles to attack the mosque. And so that was something that we were expecting. So I was at Abdullah Quilliam that whole day from Jum'ah, and we were walking around the premises, panicking and worrying about what was going to happen that evening. The security was almost readying us up for a kind of a similar attack to happen. But what happened was actually, only 50 rioters came out, or 50 protesters, which we saw across the masjid, with tens, dozens of police vans, helicopters, um, and I thought there's no way we're going to be able to hand out any burgers and chips. But actually, what happened was minutes later, no, hours later, about 10:30 p.m. That evening, we were able to cross the road. We were able to offer, the burgers and chips were ready. They were in the kind of thermal bags, and we approached the other side with those burgers and chips. And many conversations took place that day. And the first conversation was, for me, a woman, I won't name, but who was a teacher, and she was very keen to hide her identity. But the first thing she told me was, "Mashallah, sister, I think you look beautiful. I love your dress."
And
And
was this a non-Muslim woman or was this
a non-Muslim
Muslim?
woman,
Wow,
a
okay.
non-Muslim woman, a white woman who was a teacher. She had a hoodie on, two hoodies, and she made sure that no one could see her. And she said, and I said to her, "I'm glad you're not on this side. I thought she was on our side. One of the kind of one of our allies who was there to hand out food with us." And said, "No, no, no, no. I'm in the middle." And that's when it was kind of revealed to me,
What does that
or
mean? What does in the middle mean? You can't be in the middle of blatant Islamophobia, blatant racism, and basically peace.
yeah,
How can you be in the middle
yeah,
of that? Did she
yeah.
explain that?
No, so obviously I was quite. I froze for a little bit because I was like, "Hang on a minute." I was ready for a confrontation. I was ready for at least someone to tell me, "You're oppressed. You're this. You're that." And I think what was revealed to me that night was that the diversity amongst those protesters and their kind of the spectrum of racism which they have. You have some quite emboldened racists and Islamophobes, who one of which was telling me that I was oppressed and that I was oppressing her simultaneously, despite me being silent, while she was throwing her kind of anti-Muslim kind of tropes in parroting those anti-Muslim tropes. But this person, this teacher, I think is representative, or encapsulates actually the way that this almost far right rhetoric or has been normalized to the point where it's almost been acceptable to be anti-migrant or to have those views that migrants equals bad. And that's the impression that I got from her and from people like her that I engaged with, is that they were suspicious or almost concerned of who was coming in, but they couldn't necessarily verify that or back that up with any further claims. So they were parroting a lot of actually what we've seen from the media and from the government over the years, and I thought that was quite interesting.
Yeah, and you mentioned something earlier where you said, you thought that the approach that Imam Kelwick, his name is Kelwick, right?
Imam, sorry, his name was Adam Kelwick. Yeah.
Yes. So Imam Kelwick, or Imam Adam Kelwick, you mentioned that you thought initially that the approach of trying to win over hearts and minds might have been even inappropriate and naive. And you said that, or you indicated that there might be a change in that for you. So I guess walk me through your thought process and what you thought before and what you think now, and I guess what was the stimulus for changing your opinion on whether this approach is naive or not.
Yeah, so obviously we'd all seen the scenes of Southport and the riots in Southport. They were very violent, very physical, very confrontational, and very kind of openly anti-Muslim and anti-migrant as a result, as well. And so that was fully what I was expecting. So I was checking my watch to check because the counter protesters were invited to come down from 7 o'clock. 7 o'clock, we had a good crowd. We had about 300 on our side, and I thought, hang on, there's barely any people on the other side. And then throughout the evening, um, there was very little. There was some people shouting, some kids shouting, "F the migrants" or "F the immigrants," but no almost physical. And I don't know whether that was as a result of the crowds deterring them, or the police, or the kind of the infrastructure and the roading, and how maybe it might have been difficult to get to the other side of the road. But what changed for me was that interaction, that first interaction that I had with that teacher. And the fact that there was a lot of people who were refusing to take the water and refusing to take the food. But the ones who did, kind of, despite having those in the middle, kind of, again, in the middle of what I don't know, but despite that kind of frustration that they had, which they believed to have been a result of Muslims or migrants, they were willing to listen, and a lot of them were quite adamant that they had Muslim friends and that they had Arab friends and they were learning Arabic and they've got no problem with these people. But actually, there was a few statements that were made. So there's one gentleman, I'm not going to name him, but he pointed at Adam and he said, "If I'd seen someone like you blow up a place, blow up a building, and then I saw another person, so he was obviously dressed in his thobe, um, and I saw someone else, then can you blame me for being almost anti-Muslim or scared or suspicious of Muslims and Muslims coming in?" And that revealed to me actually that that education piece is so important, and that this it's not necessarily naive to want to speak to these people. It's naive to want to speak to those kind of rabid, violent racists. Absolutely, like I don't have any interest in engaging with those people, but to engage with those people who have almost themselves been victims of this misinformation and have digested it, internalized it, and kind of believed it so heavily that they've got no other choice or they've got no other alternative narrative. And I feel it's really important that as Muslims we do change that narrative. And that's not to say that the onus is wholly and fully on us. Absolutely not. But it is within our tradition to go out there and to give da'wah and to almost welcome people with open arms in our faith.
I mean, I just wanted to add that they probably don't realize that they're actually at the far right, or the violent far right thugs are actually a product of the media and far right
Mm.
influencers like Tommy Robinson and Andrew Tate. I don't think they see that perspective of themselves where we see it clearly. We're just like, you've just been mobilized by a tweet and it was of misinformation. How can you not tell that you're a pawn? Like, how can you not see that? But you're right in the
Mm.
sense that, like, we have to be patient with them. But then I mean, I know you said that onus doesn't fall on Muslims, but also, like, why is this our mess to clean up? I really don't want to deal with this personally.
Mm, mm. I guess what's the alternative? I mean, again, I don't agree with the fact that we have to, and I've had a number of these conversations over the past couple of days. Like, it's so exhausting constantly as a Muslim to have to be nice to people who want nothing but kind of terror or death upon you. And, you know, we have to take inspiration, I think, from our faith and from our tradition and from our scripture, where it tells us to respond to evil with that which is better. And that's been something that Adam's been repeating over the past couple of days. I've
Yeah.
been with him almost every single day, respond to that which is that respond to that which is evil with what is better and what is good.
Yeah, I think there's something to be said, number one, about, you know, right leaning, or I guess in the US you would call them centrists, but I don't think they're necessarily centrists. But people who appear to themselves as being in the middle, like you said. There's something to be said about the susceptibility of those people to disinformation in particular. And I think like this was very clear, at least in the US, in the Trump election in 2016, and even after that. And I mean, it's always existed before. It's just the subject of the disinformation kind of changed from Muslims, which was an acceptable subject, to then Democrats and seemingly white liberals. And that kind of brought the susceptibility of conservatives and centrists to disinformation out to, kind of the public eye. And it became something that was accepted as fact, even though arguably it's existed for a very long time. And it exists on the other side as well, but it operates under different rules. With the far right, particularly, they play towards a specific ethos of in group politics. And it's the idea that there always is an external enemy, and there is a person on the outside or a group on the outside who want terrible things for us. So it's either us or them, and we're basically protecting our people. And that's a very powerful, emotion or concept to exploit for someone who is otherwise completely apathetic and someone who is almost even apolitical, because then it turns into a survival question and not necessarily a partisan question. So there is something to be said about that, and there's something to be said about that in terms of if we as Muslims, for example, I know the conversation hasn't gotten there, but it has, maybe not here, but it has in other places where there are ideas that Muslims should start to ally with the right, or take on conservative allies, whatever that means. And I think there's something to be said that if your allies are susceptible to disinformation and can effectively turn on you over a few social media posts
Yeah.
in one night, what good are allies like that? So that's the first thing to be said. But I think the second thing that you mentioned, that I actually wanted to explore a little more, is specifically on the differences between the Liverpool protests and the Southport protests, where the Southport ones appeared to be way more violent. And a lot of us, I mean, saw the videos. And here in the US, I mean, many of us were following very intently because we've had similar incidents with our masajid. Maybe not to the level of damage. And a big reason for that is because, guns are legal in many of the states in the US. And in the same way that there are, far right groups that will arm themselves, there are also masajid that will, bring on armed security, and it acts in a way of deterrence. But it also means that the incidents that do happen are uh, generally more dangerous and more fatal. The thing I did want to kind of point out, though, is the commonality between these two protests is that they were very decidedly anti-Islam and very decidedly anti-Muslim, even conflating immigrant with Muslim, which I know is something that exists both in the UK and the US. So I'm interested in the why. Why do you think that the protests were so explicitly anti-Islam, to the point that you said, even sacrilegious things were being chanted in the protests? And I mean sacrilegious even for Christians. You are effectively, cursing out God, which is something that wouldn't be accepted by anybody of any faith that believes in God. So why do you think that these protests and the wave itself was so explicitly anti-Islam?
Layla, can I take this one if that's okay?
Absolutely. Please
Thank
do.
you.
Please do.
Okay, I think that they were so anti-Islam because the far right is actually sorry, the far right is actually allied with Zionism. Tommy Robinson, who is one of he is the EDL member, is actually got connections with Zionism. So let me just get my notes out here 1 second. So he actually is the one that spread the lie about the 17-year-old supposedly being a Muslim who came on a small boat, um, and was apparently on the MI6 hit list. He contributed to that. What's more is that when he came online to address the riots, you'd think he would come online to say things like, "I'm here. We're fighting to save our kids. We don't want immigrants to come anymore." But what does he say first? He addresses the protests that have been taking place in for Palestine. If I just quote what he said, "Why are people angry? I'll tell you why they're angry. Because Hamas were allowed to overtake London, overtake our capital city, every week flying ISIS flags, calling for jihad. The police did nothing, nothing. Instead, they arrested me." Why is he talking about Hamas and ISIS and the Palestinian protests when the focus should be the riots? I mean, it's very clear that he's been I mean, it's not even something I'm saying out of like my own head. He's actually got connections to hold on, let me bring this guy's name up. A staunch Zionist.
And while you pull that name up, this that rhetoric is very interesting because this is not too far off rhetoric from a video that I saw filmed by Andrew Tate in the first few weeks of the genocide in Gaza. I believe it was still in the end of October. And essentially, he was commenting on the protests that were happening in London. And it could have been an old video, but he definitely posted it around that time. And essentially, he was decrying the protesters. He was saying, even if their cause is valid, which I don't think they do, it's a conflict that has nothing to do with us. Israel and Palestine is not the UK. And they're
Mm.
bringing their problems here. And,
Mm.
this is what immigration has brought to the UK. And this is what immigration has brought to Europe. And he said, your countries would never let you protest this way. So you come here so you can act out in ways that your country wouldn't even accept. And it's very similar. And again, to be very fair, Andrew Tate has kind of shifted his position on Palestine since then, and his rhetoric has shifted drastically in ways that are even pro-Palestine, in a way that's even positive. However, it's interesting because it's the same exact emotion and the same exact uh, you know concept that they're trying to strike of save our children. This is the in group. Those are the
Yeah.
outsiders. It's touching on very xenophobic tropes.
I mean, if they
As
really if they really cared
no, go
about
on.
save our kids. In April there was a young black boy who was 14-year-old Daniel Anjon. He got stabbed by a white man with a sword. Where were the riots? There were no riots then. So it was never about
Police.
save our
Yeah.
kids. It's just a facade. It's just something that they use to push their violence towards Muslims.
Yeah. Yeah. There's two things that I want to come in on. So we saw obviously early October, following October 7th. Netanyahu and members of the Israeli government coming out and talking about how Hamas is ISIS. And I think while you were talking about that, that's something that kind of came into mind. Whereas, it resonates, this idea of ISIS and Muslims being a threat, it resonates with people as an instant connection where people associate almost Islam with terrorism and therefore migrants with Islam and therefore mosques with Muslims and therefore terrorism and danger. But there is an interesting thing about the language, and I was talking to my friend, Amina, about this week. Save our children, save our, and because I initially thought it was save the. I was kept on saying save the children, save the children, save the
Oh,
children, and we forget how actually this language is really important. It's
Mm-hmm.
not save the children; they don't care about children, and we've seen.
Yeah.
And one of the first things that one of the more violent protesters said to me across the road at Abdullah Quilliam Mosque was, "Do you care?" Sorry, I have to do the Scouse accent. She goes, And it's on video, and she goes, do you care about the 3 kids, the 3 little girls? And she's been parroting that at every Muslim she speaks to. I've seen other videos. And I said to her, actually, yes, I do. And it actually probably hurt me a lot more to know that 3 children, I've never ever had almost, or it wasn't until recently until I had a reference point for what kind of terrified, terrored, you know, uh, injured. There's no words to describe. I've never had that the resonance myself until this almost churning out of videos in 4K that we've seen coming from Palestine and those children. And it was interesting because she went silent. She changed the subject immediately around hijab and the women in Iran and so on. Interestingly, as well, is that a lot of these people who were at that protest on during Abdullah Quilliam that protest, sorry, a lot of them had no idea why they were outside the mosque. I said to them, okay, you've got these concerns about immigration, you've got these concerns about, your children. Why are you outside the mosque? And they were like,
I don't know.
don't know.
I've just been mobilized. I just don't realize I'm a pawn
Yeah,
in this whole thing. Tommy Robinson tweets something, and I just ran with it. Tommy
Yeah, the
and
Robinson.
funny
If
thing is, I
yeah,
mean,
sorry, go
he's
on.
not even in the UK. Like you said, he's
Yes,
vacationing in
insane.
Cyprus.
yeah.
He lives in Cyprus. I think he's moved to
Yeah,
Cyprus, or
yeah, yeah.
he's lives in, yeah.
Whilst we're
But
back on the topic of Tommy Robinson, I found the guy that pays him £10,000 a month. Where was it? His name is Robert Shulman, and these are sources from his um, from his former employee Lucy Brown. She told the Palestine Chronicle that he gets paid £10,000 by a Zionist. So I don't think
And
it's a
who's
coincidence.
who's who's Robert Schulman?
Robert Shulman is hold on, let me find that. Um, he's an American tech billionaire, supposedly.
mm,
Is he
and
the
these,
one? Yeah, is he the one behind? Sorry, the I'm forgetting the name of it, but it was a collective that recently got sued in court for trying to dox protesters through undercover operations. Is that the same person? I could be
I'm
mistaking the
not
names.
so sure if that's him, to be honest.
I
I
think,
was just about to do a deep
yeah.
dive on him. But I do know
Okay.
the Times has written that he backed a contest in Texas for cartoons mocking the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So that, I mean,
Okay. Okay.
he's obviously Islamophobic, anti-Muslim, paying Tommy Robinson £10,000 a month to do what? To probably spew hatred towards the Islamic community, the Muslims, and yeah, spew
but it does
Islamophobia.
it highlights that kind of lack of loyalty. They come across, we're British, we're not far right, we're just British patriots. That's what they keep saying in the same line. I'm not far right, just fed up. All of these things that they talk about under the guise of patriotism, nationalism. Your so-called nationalist figure is not in your nation right now. So
Yeah,
what are you? Who are you angry at, really? You know.
yeah,
And there's a lot of, and this is why this notion of dialogue is so important, and it shouldn't be on us to fix. But with these people, all they have heard is that Muslims are a threat, that Muslims are dangerous, that Muslims are terrorists, that people who dress like this should be, you should be concerned about, and people who have this idea, this ideology, and so on. And what we found over the past week, we've hosted events at Abdullah Quilliam. So we had an event on Saturday called "Is Islam a Threat?" And that was an opportunity for people who went to the protest at Abdullah Quilliam to come in and ask their questions. What did you see? There was a gentleman called Colin, and it's in a video with Adam, and he said to us, or I heard from Adam, he said that he wants to take a shahada. This guy, this just last week, he hated Muslims, and he was outside a mosque protesting, about Muslims, so called protesting, rioting, whatever you want to call it. He was there last week in opposition to Muslims, and now he's joining us. And I think that is the most important part, or the most kind of powerful part of these conversations. It's that these aren't just conversations we're having to just for fun or just to alleviate something. It's actually a conversation, or a inviting them to good. We want good for people. Just, they might want bad for us, but we will always want good for people, and that will always kind of be the better thing to do. And there's been a number of instances where people have come out and said, I want to learn more. I want to learn more. There was someone who DM'd Abdullah Quilliam their Instagram, and said, he was from America and he was traveling in the city, and he'd previously, been learning about Islam, but he saw what Imam Adam Kelwick did, and that was the catalyst for him to want to take his shahada, and he wanted to take his shahada that Friday. Um, so I think whilst it's perceived to be this almost, oh, you're just playing to that good Muslim trope, I don't believe it is. I just believe that we're playing to just being Muslims, right? We're being Muslims to people who have never seen. And these people have never interacted with Muslims. People, we went on a trip on Sunday. Sorry, I'm going on now. But on Sunday, there was a trip organized by one of the leaders who brought people to that Save Our Children protest. He invited Adam and people to a digital detox, which he was already hosting. 30 of us probably came from each side, and we engaged in more of that dialogue. And I guess I've kind of divided these people who attended these riots and protests into three. You've got the kind of the kids, the 12 to 18 year olds who are just wanting a ride. They're rioting, they're kicking the shops down, they're throwing rocks at police and so on. They are victims, but also um, victims of potentially victims of grooming. They've fallen into that group, and now they are kind of susceptible to being quite a danger, actually. Then you've got the kind of in the middlers, the people who will say, "Oh, I'm just here because I want to add a number, and I've heard about these protests, and I was really concerned about the children." They haven't interrogated that thought properly. They're the ones I prefer to focus on. And then you've got the actual kind of far right extremists, the ones who do want damage, the ones who intentionally go out to provoke and to terrorize Muslims and people of color. And I think when you understand who those people are on the other side, as I said, I was of the impression that it was very naive for Imam Kelwick to go over to the other side. Now people are calling me naive. But the people that usually make these comments have not been there and seen these people, have not met
Yep.
these people. And until you have, you'll realize why we did that.
Yeah, I think it's very important to remember, especially on the internet, it's very easy to kind of forget that there are actually people who are swept up in this, people who are involved in the situations we run into. And I think one of the uh, one of the interesting things that I've seen is usually we'll see a lot of people will afford more, particularly Muslim. I would even say Muslim youth. They'd afford more flexibility to engaging with the far right commentators who have larger platforms, who have decidedly said worse things, and are might even, for many of them, might even actually be part of the agenda, right? The agenda of anti-Islam, anti-immigrants, people of color, and the pro, even if it's subtle, white supremacy agenda. There, we've seen that there's a lot of flexibility in engaging with those kind of people publicly. Whereas when it comes to engaging with people on the ground, it's very easy to kind of be criticized as naive and as, you're appealing to them or you're appeasing them, which is, again, that's very interesting because arguably the public figures are the ones who generally cause more damage and are the ones who are more likely to actually be following an agenda versus your average Joe or your average British or UK or Welsh or wherever it is, right? Your average person who believes that they are actually under threat. So it's very interesting. And I think the other thing that I wanted to add here, I think we're probably going to wrap up soon, but the other thing that I wanted to add here is it seems that there is something very important in the way that you both have kind of been talking about engaging with the far right, or people affected by them, and it's coming from a place of dignity, coming from a place of believing in yourself and not necessarily in appeasing who they are. I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that on Tuesday night, if you guys went out and gave out burgers and fries, I'm going to call them fries because I'm American. If you gave out burgers and fries and no one accepted them, I think that would have been an acceptable conclusion to the folks who are doing that, right? Am I correct in that assumption?
And some of them on that Friday night actually did deny throughout the night. those chips. So some of them were quite stubbornly saying no.
Yeah.
But it took one person to break, then everyone else was kind of like, oh, fine. I was really starving anyway.
Right, right. And I don't think that there would have, necessarily I don't think that doing that is necessarily appeasing. And I don't think that's placating either. Even if we look in the Sirah, there are, many examples in the Prophet, peace be upon him's life, where he, did treat his enemies with what's better, but from a position of power. And I think
Mm,
that's what's very important, is kind of learning, and it's going to be a, work in progress. It's not something anyone knows the answer to. I definitely don't. But it's kind of gauging different situations and seeing how do we engage from a position of power in this situation.
mm, mm. And I think that is taking back power because when you don't respond with what they expect, they are controlling that interaction. They feel like they've got, yeah, I'm not taking those burgers and chips. But when they do, it's like, hang on a minute, we've subtly or we've engaged you now. And that was what was important about inviting people into the mosque in the first place. It's that, we are not here to play to that narrative that's in your head. We are here to take back that narrative. Um, yeah.
I just want to add to something that Mosaab said about the people, the influencers are the ones that probably have the agenda versus the average Joe. And then that also reminded me of the ayah in the Quran, إِنَّهُمْ يَكِيدُونَ كَيْدًا وَأَكِيدُ كَيْدًا. So like Tommy Robinson and all these people that are getting paid to spread all this misinformation are thinking, yes, we got them. Now the Muslims are going to they're going to burst back at us and we've got them, we can put that on the media. And then it's like, yeah, but on the ground people are literally opening up and learning about Islam, and probably some of them are converting and public opinion is changing. So
Mm.
who's actually won?
Mm. There's a lot of resonance I find actually with Gaza the past couple of months is
Yes.
that
Yep.
it has shone a light on Islam. And when these events happen, it forces people to question why
Yeah.
do we hate Muslims, man? Why are Muslims like where does it say that they're terrorists? And they'll go and find out, and they'll go in with the intention to critique Islam and to empower themselves with the knowledge of Islam, and then they realize this is actually a really beautiful religion.
Yep.
Yeah. So what do we do going forward? What do you think? What's next? I know Mosaab, you might need to go, but
Yeah.
I don't know whether we should um, close up with that question before you do.
I don't know if it's a question to close out. I think that's probably what the next conversation is going to entail, because I don't think it's a question that can be answered at one. I mean, there are so many different aspects to it in particular, and probably, I mean, definitely the most public, but probably the most damaging as well, is the interaction that we have seen between a lot of Muslim, public figures with people who would be considered, or people who are kind of targeting the far right audience, or the audience susceptible to the far right with their rhetoric. And I think that in itself is a conversation on its own. I think that's a conversation that needs to be had. And it has to do with what we do next, because um, that's probably one of the things that has the most direct impact, and the most immediate impact on our communities.
Hmm. Hmm.
I have nothing to
Khalas.
say about moving forward. I mean, I actually like what um was it Imam Kelwick? Is that his name? The burgers and chips approach. I mean, it's sweet. I would probably, if I was in Liverpool, if I find myself in a situation, I'd probably join that effort, but I would be really nervous about it. And again, I'm kind of in this like space of like, it's really not my place to fix this mess or clean this mess up. But at the same time, like life gave you lemons. What are you gonna make lemonade, or are you just gonna sit there? So
Yeah,
Hmm.
I'll probably just
and
go make lemonade.
we haven't even gotten into the American perspective of this, where the far right, it functions similarly, but there are some decidedly very different things in
Hmm.
the far right, particularly in their ability to be violent, and the capacity of their violence is very different. I mean, with America, we're talking more about things like masjid shootings, for example, which have
Oh,
happened, and there were several instances where a masjid would have someone who shows up with a gun. They shoot into the masjid, they injure people, they kill some people.
Mm.
So in dynamics like that, that's very different, and not to say that either is better than the other, but that definitely dictates the dynamics, especially in what does power mean in a situation like that. And I think that that has a whole nother conversation to it that we
Yeah.
should probably have at some point.
Yeah.
Yeah, we should.
I
Okay.
guess moving forward, then, I suppose it's very important that we continue to dissect and have a look at what are the commonalities, what are the differences between the UK and the American context, what are the similarities in our approaches, and what learnings can we take from what's taken place this week. Don't get me wrong, I would never offer burgers and chips to people that had bricks and things in their hands, and I think it's really important that we, again, it's all about understanding who your opponent is. And I think maybe that is a conversation we can have moving
Yeah.
forward.
Yeah. So I think the only thing we've agreed to basically is there is a lot more to unpack, and I think at some point we'll probably end up even talking about the left and the far left's alliance with Muslims at some point. But for now, I think we will say Jazakumullah khairan everybody for tuning along with us, and we hope to see you again inshallah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
So,
Assalamu alaikum.